Charlie died from a kick in the abdomen. The story was a car hit him. Miss Kitty, her neck was accidentally broken. Macy and Tiger both were poisoned slowly. Peanut beat to death with a crutch. It takes a truly evil person to kill such a sweet kitten. I think Trisha felt that if she couldn't keep her marriage together, it was like a failure for her.
I need to know the truth to be able to tell people that you're not a serial killer, that you're some psychopath who has no remorse over killing the mother of your child.
We were told that what they found was gruesome, and then they're like, oh, it's not pretty. And then he told us the actual details as they were pulling it out. He's like, this is not what we thought it was. He said, I've just made a deal with the devil. I can't believe it.
A single mother who loves her child more than life itself disappears into thin air. It doesn't just happen. There's something behind that.
Just trying to de-escalate the situation. They couldn't get out. I didn't know where to go. I couldn't even just leave.
I'm laughing at his acting job. He's not even good at it.
I haven't been out here very often, but occasionally I just like to because, I don't know, I just sort of feel her more here than I did in the cemetery. It's almost like you can feel her presence out here. I know she's in heaven, she's whole, she's happy. It is peaceful. It is. First date between Stephen and Trisha. I think she was either a junior or senior, so she was 17 or 18 in that picture. Sometimes you just meet someone and you just have a caution about them. He wasn't really friendly. You would think that if you're going to date somebody's daughter, you would be friendly with the parents, you would smile, you would maybe joke, your eyes might twinkle or something. Just kind of deadpan. And that just didn't fit my daughter. I don't remember when I learned that things were serious. They must have had more of a relationship than showed to me. She was a private person. She made up her own mind about things. She told me that they went on and had their own little wedding. That's about all I knew about it. I felt bad for her when I heard that because I know she would have enjoyed having a normal wedding. But she's Trisha. She will do what she will do. Trisha wanted to be a mother so badly, and she was just so happy in every stage of it. And then when that little girl was born, she was such a treasure to her. She would hardly put her down until I said, Trisha, if you want that little one to learn to crawl, you're gonna have to put her on the floor sometimes. She really loved that little girl.
This is a photo of my sister at my brother's wedding. Trisha was just really adventuresome and a really sweet girl, but like tough, from the military. She was a lot of fun. Trisha joined the Air Force out of high school. She went to basic training and stuff, and then when she got out, we just heard that she was married. I think it was just a little bit of family drama, and there wasn't another good place to go, and then I think it just took a little bit of stress off of everybody. It was a good chance for me to go see my sister, and then my sister also wanted to be in her younger brother's lives, so it worked out really well for me to go up there and stay with them. She had built a path in life, and she was doing great. Me and Stephen would play video games together a lot. I would say he would strike you as a nerd, as like a strong, well-put-together nerd. I always thought he was really smart. He was really friendly, and, I looked up to him back then. At the time, he had been deployed as an F-16 mechanic to follow Air Force One around, and it was kind of like a special honor to do that. And then he'd have to leave for a week or 2 weeks at a time for work. I know that traveling for long periods of time for work can be hard on a relationship. They were pretty happy together, but I don't think that was very far into their marriage. And I think their marriage was happier at the start, for sure.
The case started in an innocuous fashion. When I got a call from my boss, he had, in his words, a bad feeling about the situation. On April 27th, family could not locate Trisha. Her car was found with the keys to the ignition next to the residence that she was living at the time in Florida. Her purse was in the vehicle, her wallet was missing, and her cell phone was missing. That obviously sent up alarm bells relatively quickly for the family. Road Patrol deputy responded, and it started from there. Really, it was just a missing person at that point. Nothing more, nothing less. Trisha was known for going on nature hikes, long walks, and within a couple of days, missing. They had all-terrain vehicles out in rural parts of the county. It was a massive search. The air units were up looking in rural areas that were difficult to reach by motor vehicles. The community response was rapid. So between the volunteers and really the entire agency of the Martin County Sheriff's Office being involved in an all-out search for her, this really became big local news. But they were very quickly running into a dead end. In about 5 days, without any further knowledge of where Trisha was, we had a meeting at the sheriff's office. We were very quickly becoming concerned that there was foul play involved. It's not a stretch of the imagination for me to say that when a woman goes missing, it often turns out to be foul play, and that the person involved is either the husband, the boyfriend, the ex-husband, or the ex-boyfriend. I would say everybody in the room knew that the person that may be responsible and probably was responsible for her disappearance was Stephen Williams. My boss very matter-of-factly stated, "Why aren't we in North Carolina?"
In the first years of Trisha's marriage, they're in the Air Force. So when you're in the Air Force, you go where the Air Force sends you, and you have to be there. So we didn't see them that often. And when she would come home, she would talk positively about positive things. I didn't know anything was wrong. She was very good at hiding how she felt. I didn't know the worst of it for a long time. Tricia was, I'm sure, very nervous about Stephen's upcoming visit because this is the first. It was the first time after the divorce that he was allowed by the military to actually come down and actually have an in-person visit with his little girl. And then it was going to be an overnight visit for her daughter. That little girl was Tricia's most important thing in life. A big red flag to me, and when I first knew something was wrong, was the next day when Tricia did not pick up her little girl from the babysitter. Now that would tell all of us that something was wrong. And I think at that point, that's when we called the police.
They brought everyone in for questioning. They brought my dad, they brought, everyone who's even remotely involved brought him in for questioning. I think a lot of people had a lie detector test, including my dad, myself, some of my brothers. I don't think they had any leads. They were trying to chase everything and find something. I didn't suspect Stephen at all. I didn't know what had happened between him and my sister, but I just always really kind of had respect for him. And my only experience had been really positive with him. But other people did suspect Stephen. I think they questioned him right off the bat, and then they came back and they were like, well, he's pretty clear. We're gonna leave him alone. But it speaks to how much mystery there was at the time and how nobody had any answers and they were just searching for anything.
The Martin County Sheriff's Office had only spoken with Mr. Williams over the telephone. Within the first day or two, what was known was that Stephen Williams had been down from North Carolina, where he was in the Air Force. He had rented an Airbnb so that he could spend some time with their child. We know that Tricia had gone to the house that Stephen had rented based on his statement that he gave. The child had been dropped off. He mentioned that when she was about to leave, she noticed that her fuel tank was pretty much on empty. He went and obtained gasoline for her at a local gas station, returned, put gas in her car. She left, and that was the last he saw her. As far as we knew, the last person to see Tricia was her ex-husband, Stephen Williams. And as a result, he very quickly became a person of interest. A decision was made by the sheriff's office that they were going to drive up. We arrived there quite early in the morning. We knocked on the door. He answered the door. From my vantage point, he did seem somewhat surprised that we were there. He did agree to come to the Raleigh Police Department for an interview. But his story was more or less the same that he had already provided to the family, as well as to us. But when he was asked if he would agree to submit to a polygraph examination, he declined, which certainly raised alarm bells with me, and he left to head back to work. Not long thereafter, he had called in and decided that he was willing to do it. He changed his mind. I was stunned that he changed his mind and agreed to do it. And now, of course, what's going through my mind is maybe he isn't involved. I mean, who would submit to a polygraph if you are involved? He sat for the polygraph. Mr. Williams appeared to me to be calm and quite deliberate with his responses. Do you know where Tricia Todd is? No. Did you have any involvement in the disappearance of Tricia Todd? No. Surprisingly enough, the polygraph came back as inconclusive. And frankly, the polygraph examiner confided in me, said, look, maybe this guy's telling the truth, which I couldn't believe it. Honestly, I thought we were at a dead end. That was a long drive home from North Carolina. I'm not just talking about the drive time. It was a lot of conversation in the car, a lot of phone calls being made back home. What are we gonna do? What's our next move? I don't believe that we were thinking we were gonna find her alive at that point. I felt as though this was now a long shot, that I did not know how this would end.
Trisha didn't hardly talk about what had happened until she left him. That's when things started coming out. She said when he would come back from his deployment, she would go to the airport to pick him up, and there were his girlfriends waiting for him as well. But he obviously didn't care about hurting her. Frankly, I think that would have been a good time to say goodbye, Stephen. But she hung on. I think Trisha let out her feelings more on her live journal, which had a password on it, so we couldn't see it. I think that was her way of letting some of this stuff out. She had two of the cutest little dogs, and this is their picture here, Cecil and Charlie. Charlie died from a kick in the abdomen. The story was a car hit him. My neighbor helped me bury him while Stephen played video games. Miss Kitty, her neck was accidentally broken. Macy and Tiger, both were poisoned slowly. Peanut, beat to death with a crutch. I couldn't make an excuse for him that time. It takes a truly evil person to kill such a sweet kitten. I finally saw him for what he was and left him. Stephen stood and watched coldly while I cried my eyes out, cleaning up the blood. Yeah, that's terrible. That is really terrible, and I'm sure it broke her heart.
So the sheriff's office conducted an exceedingly exhaustive investigation here in this case. Much of the story that he told us up to that point did track a neighbor living in one of the homes around the rented home that Mr. Williams was at, did tell us that Mr. Williams did approach at very late in the evening. He was looking for a gas can, and when they didn't have one, he then indicates to us, well, I went down to the gas station. We were able to get the video of that. And then he returns home. So that story corroborated something that he told us between the neighbors and the video at the gas station. One of the tools that we had at our disposal were video cameras. And in this instance, it was a business that was near the Airbnb that Mr. Williams had rented. On that video camera, we believed we could make out at a point roughly 4 o'clock in the morning on April 27th, there is a figure that is walking along the road that would be coming from Trisha Todd's residence towards Mr. Williams' Airbnb. We could not make out who this individual was, but based on the height of the individual, as well as how heavy the appearance of the individual was, it could very well have been Mr. Williams. they confronted him with some of the video evidence. And during this conversation, Mr. Williams changed his story for the first time. And for the first time, the version of the events were he left to get the gas. Upon his return to the Airbnb, he went into the residence. Trisha was down unconscious with a head wound or a gash. His version is it appeared to him that she had fallen down and struck her head. He stated that for whatever reason, he panicked and he was uncertain if she was dead or not, but he did not think she was. And what he did was he loaded her body into her vehicle, drove the vehicle to a rural road, positioned her body on the side of the road, leaving her wallet and her cell phone with her, so that in the event she became conscious, she would have the means and the ability to get help or transportation.
Okay, so you come back and then
She stays in here while I go and get gas. And then I come back, put the gas in her car, put the gas can in her trunk. And when I come back inside, I figured she'd still be here or wherever, but she wasn't. So
where was she?
she was in here and she was playing this way. I wasn't even touch her initially because I didn't even know what to do. I just kind of paced and tried to figure out what I was supposed to do. I didn't know if I should call anyone because all I thought about was, great, I call the police and they show up, and then how does this look? You know, it's stupid late and your ex-spouse is unconscious on bedroom floor. Like, how does that look? You know, how do you explain that?
I didn't believe that story, but we still did not have enough to arrest him. And unless we had a body where a medical examiner could engage in a full forensic examination of the remains, and we didn't have anything else to go on.
Where did you pull off to the side of the road? Was looking familiar? Did you put her by the water?
I don't remember there being any water. If I knew where,
You do know.
I would take you
Steven,
right there.
You
That'd be-
do know where she's at. The only reason that you would not take us to her is if something else happened at house, and you're not telling me. Where did you take her to?
I don't know.
The narcissist tells these stories thinking that we're going to believe them. Someone who has an oversized sense of their own intellect and intelligence.
So your daughter's gonna grow up knowing that dad got rid of mom's body. That's
I
what
don't
your
know
daughter's gonna
anything
grow
about
up.
getting rid of the body. I don't even know what you do with the body. I don't know the first thing about any of that.
We knew Trisha Todd was dead. We just didn't know how. We didn't know where. And we weren't going to let this go. For the next few hours, we drove around relatively aimlessly, I thought. I did not think he was being truthful. Every time we would go down a road, he would say, it looks like the area, this could be it. It never was. We went back to the sheriff's office. We placed him in an interview room. Multiple people attempted to have a conversation with him, confront him with the fact that we did not believe his entire story. And we called at that point the state attorney. He instructed us to give it one more go with a fresh new detective, and hopefully a new face would jog something.
So what do you want me to tell you? What do you want me to tell you, Dad?
I want you to tell me the truth.
Because I'm telling you, I didn't hurt this woman. I
Okay.
never did anything to injure her or hurt her. My only mistake is I didn't just accept that this is the situation and call 911. That's what I should have done. I just panicked.
I need you to tell me the truth about what happened. I know you were there. I want to give you the opportunity to tell me what happened. I know you didn't, but it's not something that's you can like weigh you down for the rest of your life.
So yeah, she came over, talking about nonsense and bringing up child support. And then she's just going on and on about now I owe her more money and back child support. It just got so aggressive and I'm just trying to back away and de-escalate and I can't even leave the house now. And then she gets even more aggressive and in my face and pushing me back. And it just escalated. And then I just moved her away and then she slipped. And that's when she freaking fell. And I'm like, oh, I asked her if she was okay. It was like a weird sound. She didn't say anything though. And then I freaking panicked. I just tried to de-escalate the situation because I couldn't get out. I didn't know where to go. I couldn't even just leave. Like all I wanted to do was just leave. I just wanted nothing to do with that.
But we need to know where Trisha is.
I don't know.
I'm laughing at his acting job. I mean, he's not even good at it. It is challenging to get a conviction when there's no body. It's a challenge, but it can be done. In this instance, the detective was able to finally get him to at least admit that he had pushed her down. He's making an admission, ultimately, about what happened, and it was enough for us now to charge him with second-degree murder, based on that statement.
The county attorney called a meeting and we discussed it. You know, what did we want to do? How badly did we want to find her? That decision was important because I think I could have spent the rest of my life thinking about where she was. It would have tortured the boys too, her brothers. And what would we say to her little girl when she was grown? Stephen had a very manipulative personality. He obviously knew exactly where she was. I just wanted to find her body. Even if they had to make a deal with him, it was more important to the family to get her body back.
He had something that the parents wanted, and that was their daughter. Terrible position that they were put in, and they were quite courageous in their decision, frankly. So we collectively decided that the number was going to be 35 years in prison. I was fully expecting, okay, we're going to have a recovery of a body. There was obviously, going to be decomposed remains at this point. It's roughly a month later, but nothing more than that. Never in my wildest dreams did I think that it was going to end up being what it was. Once the plea deal was accepted by the judge, Mr. Williams' lawyer explained to me for the exhumation of the remains of Trisha Todd, we were going to need a hazmat team. And I literally asked him, what are you talking about? And he explained to me that we'll find that she has been dissolved in acid. And he went on to tell me that he had dismembered her, removing all of her teeth, and also removing all of her fingertips. It was terrible.
So where you place the flag is where. Okay, and about how far down the boat? Okay. It's about 2.5 feet down. Okay. And there's no way it could be any back further, or you're certain this is it here?
This would be
Okay.
All he is just doing is, in an unemotional way, just bringing us to the remains of Trisha. I got the sense that he just didn't want to be there. Is this guy a human? Right? That's what everyone's asking themselves. Members of fire rescue were able to bring this plastic tub up, and lifting it out of the ground was a frothy, reddish soup of what turned out to be the remains of Trisha Todd that were overflowing. And all that was ultimately recovered, all that was not liquefied, that was located, was part of Trisha's pelvic region, as well as part of her torso. We were frankly numb. I was numb. What you saw was something that you don't unsee. Shock. This was the most horrendous case that I've ever been involved in as a prosecutor. You know, this case is a perfect example, is you never know about the evil that is among us. You recognize the true evil that Stephen Williams is.
We were told that what they found was gruesome and we shouldn't come if we weren't prepared to come. And then I remember that only a couple of us went. Like, I remember one of the first details we got was, well, it's buried. It's not on the surface, like he said. And so they're like, that's a bad sign. And then they're like, oh, it's not pretty. And then, like, he told us, like, the actual details as they were pulling it out. He's like, you know, this is not what we thought it was. He said, like, I've just made a deal with the devil. I can't believe it.
A dive team ended up going into a body of water that was adjacent to where we found her remains. Electric saws were located. They still had what appeared to be flesh in them. I believe some pliers were located. And then on the bank, saw teeth where Mr. Williams dropped some teeth as apparently before he was able to actually throw them into the water. Just a terrible, terrible situation. That was quite a moment. I'd never seen anything like that, and I hope that I never do again.
Well, what he had done was to dismember her with a chainsaw that he bought at least a month earlier. And then he put her in a Rubbermaid tub and filled it with acid and buried the tub. Yeah, it was horrible. What kind of heart must somebody like that have? Very evil one. But you can, like, take maybe a certain amount of time and think about that for a while, but then you have to put it away. You can, and if you carry it heavy all the time, you're gonna make yourself sick. So you just, I think it's just something you learn. I didn't know it before. I had to kind of learn.
It was our understanding that he was having to pay child support. And that was certainly something that he did not want to have to be responsible for. I would say that, unfortunately, people have killed for less. After it was all said and done and further investigations were able to be done by investigators with the Air Force, it was discovered that on some of Ms. Williams' computers at work on the Air Force Base had been utilized for research in terms of methodologies of killing and acid. And he had also purchased the chemicals had the plastic containers, the tubs, and he would have had to drive many hundreds of miles from North Carolina to Hobe Sound with all of this in his car. It explains why when offered the polygraph exam, he initially said no. Then it explains why he may have changed his mind. This was definitely a heightened premeditated event for sure. Thought out, planned out. He had the whole thing worked out. It doesn't matter because we cut a deal and we have to live with it. No one would cut deals with prosecutors if you didn't agree to follow through on what you promised to do. The plea deal in this case with both myself and my colleagues and my boss too, really got under our skin. This wasn't justice. Not for Trisha. The Air Force has a slam dunk first-degree murder case. Can't lose. Stephen Williams played everybody, right? I mean, yeah, he's serving prison time. He's doing 35 years. But in 2046, he wins. Stephen Williams played us. And he played on Trisha's parents. He knew that they were going to jump at wanting the body, wanting her remains. Yeah, he got us. Wish we could have done more.
We talked about what Trisha should be remembered for a lot when it was happening. And we came to that Trisha would forgive, so that we should. It was a huge honor to Trisha. I think if we hadn't thought of that, I don't think we would have made it through as calmly. I think before we thought of that, we were all in emotional distress about it and kind of freaking out. And then after we came to that, it made us able to deal with it a lot better. I struggle to think that people have evil in them. And a lot of people disagree with that. I got one tattoo after Trisha died. For Trisha, I got understanding tattooed on my ribs, and to remind myself to always try. And to me, that carries the same function that forgiving people does for other people. It's been rough. It's hard on the brain going through the stress, and I think some of us make it a point to not dwell on the past, but yeah.
There wasn't much of her left to bury. We had her cremated and she was just in this little box. The little Air Force sticker on the top. But I don't focus on what was left of her. I know where she is. I know she's in heaven. She's whole. She's happy. She wanted to get married again. She wanted to have a happy family. She actually bought this wedding dress at a thrift store, which I thought was very ugly. Didn't tell her so, but I thought, Trisha, no. And after she died, and I found out what happened to her, and that's when God just spoke to me and said, this is the part that I gotta try not to cry. He said, she didn't need that old body. I've given her a brand new one. And I'm giving her a wedding dress that's more beautiful than you can imagine. And that just went, leave. He didn't take her away forever because I intend to go to heaven too, and I will have her forever and ever and ever. He did not take her away forever. Right around here's where he buried her. It might have been right up there. This is kind of a place Tricia would have liked. She was a very outdoor person. Not that she'd want her final remains here, but this is a kind of place she would have liked to visit it. I sometimes just like to kind of feel her. She would have liked it out here.
I just can't imagine that kind of horror. She had to know she was running for her life. I just want to know why and who would do that to Kay.
It wasn't just random. You don't cut somebody's throat from ear to ear just randomly. That was done to send a message.
Texas 1998 cold case solved. DNA breakthrough leads to shocking arrest. The call came in just after midnight. A quiet line crackling in the dark. The kind of call that doesn't sound urgent until you realize no one on the other end is speaking. Only breathing. Shallow, uneven, like someone trying not to be heard. And then it cuts, just like that, leaving behind nothing but a timestamp and a question that would sit unanswered for years, buried under dust, paperwork and silence. By sunrise, the town already knew something was wrong. Not because of sirens. There were none. Not yet. It was the stillness. The kind that presses down on a place, wraps around houses, seeps into sidewalks, settles into the spaces between neighbors who suddenly avoid eye contact because everyone feels it before they understand it. Something has happened, something bad, something that doesn't belong here. The house sat at the edge of a quiet road outside Austin, Texas. One story, white siding, a porch light that never turned off even during the day. Inside, everything looked untouched. Coffee still in the mug, a chair slightly pulled back, a television humming low to an empty room. No signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no struggle that would scream violence. And yet the air inside was wrong. Heavy, disturbed, holding on to something it refused to give up. She was found in the hallway, 27 years old, known in the neighborhood, not famous, not loud, not someone you'd expect to become a headline. The kind of person described later with the same words repeated over and over, quiet, kind, kept to herself, always smiled. Now reduced to a scene, now reduced to evidence. The first officers on site moved carefully, their voices low, their steps measured, but even then, something didn't add up. There were no defensive wounds, no overturned furniture, no clear sign of how this had happened so quickly, so cleanly, so silently. It didn't look like a break-in. It looked like someone had been invited inside. Or worse, someone had never left. The investigation began the way they all do. Questions, timelines, names scribbled onto notepads, friends, coworkers, neighbors, anyone who might have seen something, heard something, noticed something out of place. But every answer led nowhere, every detail dissolving into the same frustrating conclusion. Nothing. No witnesses. No suspects. No motive. Just a growing sense that whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. The case file thickened, pages stacking up with interviews, lab reports, theories that went nowhere. Detectives chased leads that evaporated under scrutiny, circled back to the same people, the same questions, the same dead ends. And then the first headline hit. Cold case. 2 words that carry weight, finality, a quiet admission that something has slipped through the cracks, that time is beginning to win, that answers are no longer expected, only hoped for. But the town didn't forget. You don't forget something like this. Not when it happens this close. Not when it feels this personal. Years passed, but the story lingered, resurfacing in whispers, in late-night conversations, in the way people locked their doors just a little earlier, checked their windows just one more time before bed. Because the truth was simple. Whoever did this was still out there, living, working, blending in, and getting away with it. Inside the evidence room, the case didn't move. Boxes labeled, sealed, stored. Photographs fading slightly at the edges. Reports typed on aging paper. And somewhere in that collection, something small, something almost invisible, waited to be noticed. DNA. Back in 1998, it was there, collected, logged, preserved with care, but the technology wasn't ready, not yet, not advanced enough to turn that trace into a name, a face, a person you could bring into a room and say, "We know it was you." So it sat, year after year, silent, patient, waiting for a future that hadn't arrived yet. Meanwhile, the world outside changed. People moved away. New families moved in. The house was sold, repainted, reshaped into something that no longer looked like a crime scene, at least not on the surface. Children played in the yard. Cars came and went. Life continued, as it always does, building over the past like layers of paint hiding cracks beneath. But cracks don't disappear. They just wait, and sometimes they split wide open. It wasn't until decades later that the case was pulled back into the light. Not because of a confession, not because of a witness suddenly remembering something they had forgotten, but because of a system update, a database expanded, a technology refined. DNA that had once been meaningless now carried weight, precision, the ability to point, not vaguely but directly. To say, "This belongs to someone." To say, "Find them." The detective who reopened the file wasn't there in 1998. Different generation, different training, less willing to accept that some cases are simply meant to remain unsolved. He saw the file not as a closed chapter, but as unfinished work. And he started from the beginning. Every photo, every report, every overlooked detail. He noticed things others hadn't, or maybe things they had seen but couldn't use at the time. Patterns, inconsistencies, tiny fractures in the narrative that suggested something had always been slightly off. And then came the test. The sample was sent out again, this time through updated systems, cross-referenced against databases that didn't exist back then, compared against profiles built over years, decades, millions of entries forming a network of possibilities. Days passed, then weeks, and then the result came back. A match. Not partial, not uncertain, clear, direct. The kind of result that changes everything in a single moment. The name attached to that match wasn't in the original file. Not a suspect, not a witness, not someone anyone had looked at closely. Just a man who had lived his life quietly, steadily, under the radar, moving through the same world as everyone else, carrying a past that had never caught up to him. Until now, the arrest didn't happen immediately. It never does. There are procedures, confirmations, steps that have to be followed to make sure that when the moment comes, it holds, it stands, it doesn't collapse under pressure. But word began to spread, quietly at first, then louder, then everywhere. The cold case was moving again, and suddenly, the past wasn't so distant anymore. It was right there, breathing, waiting, and about to collide with the present in a way no one was prepared for. The man didn't run. That was the first thing that unsettled them. When they finally came for him, years after the night that had frozen a town in place, he opened the door like any other morning, like nothing in his world had shifted, like the past hadn't just reached forward and wrapped its hand around his throat. No panic, no confusion, just a pause, a fraction too long, the kind that doesn't register unless you're trained to see it. And then calm, too calm. He listened as they spoke, as they said his name, as they mentioned the case, the year, the place, 1998. And for a moment, something flickered behind his eyes, something sharp, something buried, like a memory forced to the surface after years of silence. But it disappeared just as quickly, gone, replaced by composure. He didn't resist, didn't ask questions, didn't deny anything. He simply stepped aside and let them in. Inside, the house told a different story. Not of violence, not of chaos, but of control. Everything in its place. Surfaces clean. No clutter. No sign of a life unraveling. If anything, it looked like someone who had spent years making sure nothing appeared out of order. Because disorder draws attention. And attention is dangerous. They searched carefully, methodically, knowing that what they were looking for might not be obvious, might not even exist anymore in physical form. Time erases things. Paper decays. Objects disappear. But habits leave traces. And traces lead somewhere. Drawers opened. Closets inspected. Boxes unpacked. Every item cataloged. Every detail noted. Every possibility considered. The kind of search that doesn't rush, doesn't assume, doesn't overlook. Because this wasn't just any case. This was a cold case that had come back to life. And that changes everything. Back at the station, the room felt different. Tighter. Heavier. The air carried expectation. Tension stretched thin between officers who had only known the case as a file, a story, something distant. And now suddenly it was real, sitting in a chair under fluorescent lights, breathing, waiting. He said very little, answered questions with precision, not emotion. Yes. No. I don't remember. That phrase came up often. Too often. I don't remember where I was. I don't remember knowing her. I don't remember that night. But memory is a fragile thing, and selective memory even more so. It bends under pressure, shifts when confronted, cracks when the weight becomes too much. And the detectives knew exactly how much weight they had. They laid it out slowly, carefully, not all at once. First, the timeline, where he lived back then. How close he had been. Close enough to walk. Close enough to know the area. Close enough to be there without drawing attention. Then the connections. Loose at first. Almost nothing. But not quite nothing. A shared space. A familiar route. A place both of them had been seen before. Not together, but not entirely separate either. The kind of overlap that doesn't mean much until it does. He listened. Still calm. Still composed. But the pauses were getting longer. The answers slower. And then came the moment. The one they had been waiting for. The one that changes the tone of a room. DNA. They didn't raise their voices. Didn't need to. They simply placed it on the table between them, not physically, but in words that carry the same weight, the same finality. We have your DNA. Not a possibility. Not a theory. A fact. It was found there. At the scene. Back in 1998. Collected. Preserved. And now matched. Silence followed. Not the ordinary kind. Not the kind filled with shifting chairs or distant noise. This was a silence that pressed in, that demanded something in return. And for the first time, he didn't answer immediately. His eyes dropped, just slightly. His hands, resting on the table, tightened, fingers pressing into the surface as if grounding himself, as if holding on to something that was slipping away. Seconds passed, then more. And in those seconds, everything that had been buried for decades hovered just beneath the surface, threatening to break through. But it didn't. Not yet. He exhaled. Slow. Controlled. And when he spoke again, his voice hadn't changed. I don't know how that's possible. A denial. Simple. Clean. But thinner now. Less certain. Because DNA doesn't forget. It doesn't fade. It doesn't get confused. It waits. Just like the case had. And now it was speaking. Outside, the story was already spreading. News stations picked it up within hours. The headline moved fast, cutting through the noise, grabbing attention, pulling people back into something they thought had ended years ago. Texas 1998 cold case solved. DNA breakthrough. Shocking arrest. The words repeated, echoed, amplified across screens, radios, conversations, bringing with them a wave of disbelief, of curiosity, of something close to fear. Because the implication was clear. Someone had lived among them. For years. Carrying a secret no one had seen. Neighbors came forward. Colleagues. People who had known him, worked with him, spoken to him in passing. Shared space without ever suspecting that behind the normal routines, behind the polite exchanges, there was something else entirely. He seemed normal. That was the word. Normal. It always is. Until it isn't. Back in the interrogation room, the pressure continued. They didn't push too hard. Didn't rush. They let the silence do its work. Let the evidence settle in. Let the reality of a situation take shape in a way that couldn't be ignored. Because this wasn't about forcing a confession. It was about breaking through something built over decades. Layer by layer. Lie by lie. Or truth by truth. Depending on what he chose to give them. And still, he held the line. Denied knowing her. Denied being there. Denied everything that connected him to that night. But denial has limits. And those limits were getting closer. The case file, once closed, now expanded again. New pages added, new angles explored. Old details re-examined under a different light, revealing things that hadn't been visible before, or hadn't been understood. Witness statements revisited, old leads reopened, people contacted again, voices from the past pulled into the present, asked the same questions they had answered years ago, but now with new context, new weight. And slowly, pieces began to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to suggest that the story from 1998 had never been complete. That something had been missing. Something important. Something that had been overlooked. Or hidden. And now, with the arrest, with the DNA, with the renewed attention, that missing piece was beginning to take shape. But it didn't fit cleanly. It didn't resolve everything. In fact, it raised new questions, more unsettling than the ones before. Because if he had been there, if the DNA was his, then what exactly had happened inside that house? There were still no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, no clear motive, no explanation for how a quiet night had turned into a scene that would haunt a town for decades. And that was the part that refused to settle, the part that kept investigators awake. Because solving a case isn't just about finding a person. It's about understanding the story. And this story wasn't finished yet. The timeline refused to behave. It stretched, twisted, bent around gaps that no one could fill, as if the night itself had been edited, pieces cut out, rearranged, hidden somewhere just out of reach. Detectives laid it out again and again, hour by hour, minute by minute, trying to force it into something coherent, something that made sense, but every version collapsed under its own weight. Because one question kept returning. How did he get in? There were no signs of forced entry. Not then. Not now. Doors intact. Windows sealed. Locks untouched. The kind of scene that suggests familiarity, trust, a moment where nothing felt wrong until it was far too late. Which meant one of two things. She knew him, or she believed she did. That possibility changed everything. Names that had once been dismissed were pulled back into focus. People who had crossed her path, however briefly, were reconsidered, reevaluated, their connections mapped out with sharper lines, tighter scrutiny. Old interviews were replayed, voices from decades ago echoing through modern speakers, revealing subtle hesitations, phrases that now sounded different, heavier, loaded with meaning they hadn't carried before. And somewhere in those recordings, something shifted. A mention. Quick. Almost forgettable. A neighbor recalling a man seen walking near the house days before the murder. Not unusual. Not alarming. Just a detail added, and then lost among hundreds of others. But now, with a name attached to DNA, that detail refused to stay small. They tracked the statement back, found the original report, the officer who had taken it long retired, the handwriting faded but still legible. The description was vague. Height, build, nothing distinctive. The kind of description that could apply to dozens, maybe hundreds of men in the area at the time. But one line stood out. He didn't look lost. Not wandering. Not passing through. He looked like he knew where he was. Like he belonged there. That single sentence tightened the focus. Because it aligned too closely with everything else. The proximity. The lack of forced entry. The absence of chaos. It painted a picture not of intrusion, but of access. And access suggests something deeper. Back in the interrogation room, they shifted their approach. No longer just facts. Now, narrative. They began to tell the story as they saw it, not accusing, not directly, but laying it out piece by piece, building a version of that night that he had to listen to, had to sit with, had to process whether he wanted to or not. You were there, one of them said quietly, not as a question, but as a statement that hung in the air. No response. You knew the area. You'd been nearby before. Maybe you saw her. Maybe you spoke to her. Maybe it didn't mean anything at first. Still nothing. But something changed. A pause. A shift in his posture, almost imperceptible but enough. Something that night. His jaw tightened. And for a moment, just a moment, the composure cracked. Not fully. Not enough to collapse. But enough to reveal strain. Because stories have power. Especially when they get close to the truth. Outside, the pressure continued to build. Reporters dug into his past, pulling records, piecing together a life that, on the surface, had been unremarkable. Jobs held, addresses changed, relationships that started and ended without incident. Nothing that screamed violence. Nothing that pointed directly to the kind of act that had defined the case. But that only made it worse, because it meant there had been no warning, no signal, nothing for anyone to see. Which raises another question. Was it the only time? Investigators couldn't ignore that possibility. They couldn't assume this was an isolated event, not without checking, not without digging deeper, comparing unsolved cases, looking for patterns that might connect, similarities that might have gone unnoticed. Databases were searched, cases reviewed, old files reopened, but nothing matched cleanly. No clear series, no obvious repetition. Just this one case, standing alone, isolated in its brutality and its silence, which made it even more difficult to understand. Back in 1998, the medical examiner had noted something unusual, not in the cause of death. That had been clear, but in the absence of struggle. There were signs, yes, but not what you would expect, not the kind that indicated a prolonged fight, a desperate attempt to escape. It was as if the moment had escalated quickly, too quickly for resistance to fully form. That detail had been filed away, considered, but never fully explained. Now it returned, stronger, more relevant, because it suggested control, speed, precision, not necessarily planning in the traditional sense, but a kind of decisiveness, a willingness to act without hesitation once the moment presented itself. And that raised another possibility. This wasn't random. Or if it started that way, it didn't end that way. The detectives circled back again. Different angles, different questions. They brought up the neighbor's statement, the sighting, the presence. You were seen, they said calmly, evenly. His eyes lifted, met theirs. For the first time, there was something else there. Not fear. Not exactly. Recognition. As if a piece of the past had just been placed in front of him, undeniable, unavoidable. It was a long time ago, he said. Not a denial. Not an admission. Something in between. A shift. Small, but significant, because it broke the pattern. It moved away from I don't remember, and into something else. Something closer to acknowledgement. The room felt it. That change. That subtle movement toward something real. And they pressed, gently. Long time doesn't change where you were. Silence. It doesn't change what happened. His gaze dropped again. Hand still on the table. Still steady. But the tension had returned, stronger now, running through his posture, through the way he held himself, like someone balancing on a thin edge. I used to walk around there, he said finally. A statement. Careful. Measured. I walked a lot back then. Another piece. Placed deliberately, but incomplete. Did you see her? No answer. Did you go inside? His fingers tightened again. A pattern forming. A physical response where words refused to go. Outside, the community watched it unfold in real time. Updates rolling in. Speculation rising. People revisiting their own memories, questioning moments they had never questioned before, wondering if they had seen something, missed something, overlooked something that now, suddenly mattered. Because when a cold case reopens, it doesn't just affect the past. It reshapes the present, and it forces everyone connected to it, even loosely, to reconsider what they thought they knew. Back in the room, the silence stretched again. But it wasn't empty. It was full. Full of pressure. Full of expectation. Full of the weight of years pressing down on a single moment. And then, almost quietly, almost like it slipped out before he could stop it, he said. The door wasn't locked. Everything stopped. Not physically. Not visibly. But internally. For the investigators. For the case. For the narrative they had been building. That sentence landed with force. Because it answered a question. And created 10 more. They didn't react immediately. Didn't show it. They let it sit. Let him hear what he had just said. Let the realization settle in. Because you don't mention a door unless you've seen it. Unless you've been there. Unless you remember. And memory was no longer something he could deny so easily. The line had been crossed. And there was no going back. The words, the door wasn't locked, didn't echo in the room like a confession. They sank instead. Heavy and slow. Like something dropped into deep water where no one could immediately see the bottom. But everyone understood the depth had just changed. No one spoke for a moment. Not because there was nothing to say, but because anything said too quickly would break the shape of what had just formed. Investigators had learned over years that silence, when it follows the right sentence, becomes louder than questioning. It presses, it expands, it forces memory to do what interrogation sometimes cannot. He noticed it too. That shift. It wasn't dramatic on the surface, no sudden breakdown, no visible collapse, but something in the way he adjusted in his seat changed, as if the room had tilted slightly and he was recalibrating his balance. A locked door is an assumption, an unlocked door is a decision, and decisions have owners. The detective leaned forward just enough to let the weight of that distinction settle between them. "You were inside," he said, not as a question anymore, but as a narrowing path. No immediate response. Outside the room, fluorescent lights hummed, indifferent to the direction of the conversation, indifferent to the fact that a case sealed for decades was now bending back on itself, revealing angles no one had been able to see when time was still standing in the way. Inside, the man exhaled through his nose, slow, controlled, almost measured enough to feel rehearsed. "I don't remember like that," he said finally. Not denial, not admission, a distortion. And that was different. Because distortion is what happens when memory exists but refuses to align with consequence. The file from 1998 was opened again, physically this time, spread across the table like an old map. Photographs, grainy but still sharp enough to carry emotion if you stared too long. The hallway, the angle, the light, the stillness of a moment that had never moved on, no matter how many years passed outside it. Her image was there again. And even after all this time, even in black and white print that had faded at the edges, there was something about the way she had been captured that made the room feel narrower. Not fear. Recognition of loss. The kind that doesn't resolve. They slid the photo closer. He didn't look at it immediately. That hesitation mattered. It always does. Because people don't hesitate with strangers. They hesitate with memory. When he finally did look, it wasn't dramatic. No visible shock. No immediate reaction. Just a steady gaze that lingered a fraction longer than neutrality allows. Then his eyes shifted away. Almost immediately. But not fast enough. "I didn't hurt her," he said. The first time it came out that clean. Not "I don't remember." Not "I don't know." I didn't. Direct. Simple. Fragile. Because denial and denial-adjacent statements can survive ambiguity. But this kind of sentence only survives certainty. The room tightened again, but still no one interrupted it. They let it exist in the air, incomplete without follow-up, hanging like something waiting to either be confirmed or dismantled. "You were there," the detective repeated. A reminder. A pressure point. "You said the door wasn't locked." A pause. "You knew enough to notice that." Silence. And in that silence, something began to surface again behind his eyes. Not clarity, not resolution, but movement, as if the memory being discussed was no longer static, but reacting to being spoken aloud. The case file had always described a lack of struggle. But now, that lack took on a different shape. Not absence. Interruption. Something happening too quickly for resistance to fully form. Something that didn't unfold like violence as people imagine it, but like a shift in direction, a moment where control changes hands without warning. And that kind of moment doesn't leave obvious lines. It leaves questions that don't fit neatly into legal language. Outside the interrogation room, the second wave of media coverage was already forming. The arrest had moved from headline to narrative, from news to speculation. Analysts, retired detectives, online voices all trying to reconstruct a night they had never seen, using fragments that were never meant to be public in this way. Cold case. DNA match. Unsolved for decades. Now suddenly active again. But no one could agree on what it meant. Not fully, because the facts were still resisting interpretation. Inside the room, the conversation shifted again, carefully, like someone stepping closer to the edge of a structure that might not support weight evenly. They brought up time. Not just the year, but the hours. Where he was before. Where he went after. The gaps. The spaces between confirmed points. He answered some of it. Not all. Never all. But enough to build a shape that was no longer empty. Enough to suggest movement that night. movement that intersected with hers in ways that had never been officially confirmed, but were now impossible to ignore. And then came the question that changed the tone again. Why didn't you report it? A pause. Longer this time. Because reporting implies awareness. And awareness implies understanding. And understanding implies something no one had been willing to attach to this case for decades. Responsibility. I didn't think, he started, then stopped. Reframed. I didn't think it would matter. That sentence didn't land like truth or lie. It landed like avoidance of consequence, like something said to keep the past from fully arriving in the present. But it arrived anyway. Slowly. Inevitable. Because now the case was no longer just about what happened inside that house. It was about what came after. Years of silence. Years of normalcy. Years where nothing interrupted the surface of a life that, from the outside, had continued without fracture. That contradiction was becoming harder to hold in the same space as the evidence. And investigators knew it. The DNA didn't just place him at the scene. It anchored him there. And once something is anchored, it doesn't drift anymore. It stays. Even if everything around it tries to move forward. The detective closed the file gently, not as an end, but as a pause, as if acknowledging that the case had reached a point where pushing further in that moment would only scatter what was already beginning to form. You're not going anywhere, he said quietly. Not a threat, a statement of reality. Because cold cases don't reopen cleanly. They reopen with pressure. And pressure reveals shape, even when no one is ready to name it yet. He didn't respond. But he also didn't look away. And that, more than anything so far, told him the direction this was moving. Not toward confusion, not toward denial, but toward something far more unstable. A memory that was finally starting to speak in its own language again. The silence after the file closed didn't feel like an ending. It felt like pressure building behind a sealed wall, waiting for the smallest fracture to turn it into something uncontrollable. He remained in the same position, but something about stillness had changed. It was no longer calm. It was restraint. The kind that costs energy to maintain, the kind that starts to show in micro-movements, in the way a breath is held too long, in the way I stop settling anywhere for too long. The detective noticed it immediately, because at this stage, the case wasn't about what had been said anymore. It was about what was being held back. Outside the interrogation room, the building felt different too. Phones were buzzing without being answered. Footsteps moved with less certainty. Everyone had the same unspoken understanding. This wasn't a cold case anymore in the traditional sense. It had become active, unstable, still forming its final shape even after decades of being frozen. Back inside, the detective slid a second folder onto the table, not with force, but with precision, like placing something fragile in a position where it could no longer be avoided. It wasn't new evidence. It was old evidence, recontextualized. Photographs from the scene. But not the ones most people saw in summaries or reports. These were closer, more detailed, the kind that noticed things you wish you hadn't noticed. A faint mark near the doorway. A partial print that had never been usable before. A trace that had sat meaningless for years until database expansion turned fragments into connections. And now it wasn't a fragment anymore. It was a match. He didn't look down immediately. That hesitation returned again, sharper this time. And when he did, it was brief. Controlled. Almost mechanical, as if looking too long might allow something inside the image to transfer into him. The detective watched him carefully. You were in that hallway, he said. Not a question. A placement. A confirmation waiting to be accepted. The man exhaled slowly, and this time there was a change in rhythm, subtle but visible. The composure wasn't breaking, but it was no longer seamless. It had seams now. I was there, he said finally. 3 words. Simple. Unadorned. And heavier than anything he had said before. The room didn't react immediately because professionals learn not to react to first openings. First openings are fragile. They can close again. They can collapse under pressure. They can be retracted. So they waited, letting the silence do what it always does in moments like this, stretch meaning until it becomes unavoidable. The detective leaned back slightly, not easing tension, but adjusting to a new phase. Start there, he said quietly. And for a moment, it seemed like the man might stop again. Might retreat back into denial, into uncertainty, into the safer space of not remembering. But something had shifted now. The door, once closed tightly around decades of silence, had begun to loosen. Not all at once, but enough. He looked down at his hands, as if they belonged to someone else, as if they were objects being examined for the first time in a long time. I didn't go there too, he started, then stopped. The sentence fractured before it could complete itself. Because some memories don't arrive as full events. They arrive as fragments of sensation. A street, a light, a sound, a moment that doesn't yet have moral definition attached to it. The detective didn't interrupt. He knew better. Because once a narrative begins forming on its own, interruption risks pushing it back into silence. The man swallowed and continued. I was walking, he said. I didn't plan anything. That word lingered. Plan. Because planning implies structure, intent, direction. But what followed didn't feel like structure in the way he spoke it. It felt like drift, movement without anchor. I saw the door, he added. A pause. Longer now, as if remembering cost more than speaking. It was open. And there it was again. The door. Not locked. Not forced. Not broken. Open. That single detail, repeated now from a different angle, began to assemble itself into something neither side fully controlled. Because open doors are invitations, or accidents, and the difference between those two things defines everything that follows. The detective's voice stayed steady. You went in. Not a question. A continuation. The man nodded once. Barely. Almost imperceptible. Yes. The word didn't come with emotion attached. It came like acknowledgement of geography, like confirming a location on a map rather than admitting to an action with consequence. But consequence doesn't wait for emotional alignment. It just accumulates. Outside, the story had already escalated again. News outlets weren't just reporting anymore, they were reconstructing. Analysts replayed timelines, reinterpreted details, debated possibilities. The phrase cold case solved was still being used, but it no longer matched the complexity unfolding inside that room. Because solving wasn't what this felt like. This felt like exposure. Slow. Layered. Unstable. Inside, the detective moved carefully again. What happened when you went in? The question hung differently than before. Not accusatory. Not leading. Just open enough for collapse or clarity. The man didn't answer immediately. His eyes shifted, not to the table, not to the photo, but somewhere beyond the room entirely, as if the walls had dissolved and he was no longer sitting in the present. I remember, he started, then stopped again. Frustration flickered, not outward but inward, the kind that comes when memory resists coherence, when fragments refuse to align into something safe or simple. I remember the hallway, he said finally. A small correction. Anchoring. I remember hearing something behind me. The room tightened without movement. Not physically, but in attention. Because sound is always more reliable than intention in old cases. Sound survives where memory distorts. What kind of sound? The detective asked. A beat. A chair, he said. Moving. Another pause. Then quieter. I think she knew I was there. That sentence changed the temperature in the room again. Because it introduced a different axis entirely. Not intrusion. Not accident. Awareness. The detective didn't rush forward. Didn't press too hard. He let it breathe, knowing that anything pushed too quickly would fold back into silence. And then, he asked. The man closed his eyes briefly. Not long. Just enough to disappear for a moment. I don't remember everything, he said. A return. Not to denial, but limitation. But I remember it ended fast. Fast. That word landed differently. Because fast events don't leave time for layers. They leave gaps. And gaps are where cold cases live for decades. The room stayed still after that. Even the air felt suspended. Because now the story had shape, but not resolution. And shape without resolution is the most unstable form a case can take. Outside, somewhere in the building, a phone rang again. Unanswered. Because everyone already knew that whatever came next would not fit neatly into anything that had been expected. And inside the room, for the first time since the interrogation began, the detective realized something important. This wasn't just about solving a case that had been cold for years. It was about discovering what had always been sitting inside it, waiting, unspoken. Until now, the word fast didn't leave the room after he said it. It stayed, clinging to the air like residue, refusing to dissolve, because in cases like this, speed is never neutral. Fast can mean panic, or instinct, or accident, or control. Fast can mean something escalated before anyone understood it was already irreversible. And in the silence that followed, the detective understood something important. They were no longer dealing with fragments of denial. They were dealing with fragments of sequence, order, event, progression, even if the edges were still broken. He leaned forward slightly, voice steady but sharper in focus. Start from when you entered, not pressure, structure, because structure was the only way to pull memory out of collapse. The man didn't respond immediately. His gaze stayed fixed somewhere between the table and nothing, as if the room had faded just enough for something else to appear behind it. When he spoke, his voice was lower than before, less controlled, not weaker, but less defended. I didn't think I'd go inside, he said. That distinction mattered. Not intent, not plan, drift. I was just standing there. A pause, the kind that suggests something is being rebuilt in real time. I remember the door moving slightly, like it wasn't fully closed. I don't know why I noticed it. I just did. The detective didn't interrupt, because now the case was doing something it hadn't done in decades. It was unfolding, not being solved. Unfolding. I stepped in, he continued, just for a second. I wasn't supposed to. Supposed to. Another loaded phrase, because it implies an internal boundary already in place before anything external intervenes. The hallway returned again, reconstructed piece by piece through fractured recollection. Not as a crime scene yet, but as a space before definition, before consequence attached itself to every detail. I heard her before I saw her, he said. The room tightened again. Not visibly, but in attention. What did she say? The detective asked. A pause. Longer now, because language inside memory behaves differently than language under questioning. It resists extraction. It delays. It reshapes itself depending on pressure. I don't know if she said anything, he answered finally. A correction immediately followed. Or maybe she did. I just remember a sound. Not words. Just noticing someone was there. That distinction mattered too, because noticing is mutual. I turned, he said, and now the scene began to assemble itself not as a static image, but as motion. I saw her. No embellishment. No delay. Just that. The simplicity of it made the moment heavier, not lighter. The detective stayed still. And what did you do? He asked. Another silence. Not refusal. Processing. I froze, he said. A breath. And then I moved closer. The phrasing mattered again. Not approached. Moved. Less intention. More drift. I don't remember deciding to, he added quickly, almost as if correcting the direction of meaning before it solidified. But meaning was already forming. And once formed, it doesn't wait for permission. Outside the room, the building felt smaller. The investigation had begun to shift from procedural review into something closer to reconstruction. Old files were no longer just being read, they were being reinterpreted in sequence. Every detail was now being tested not for existence, but for position in time. Inside, the man continued. I think she realized I wasn't supposed to be there, he said. That sentence opened something wider, because it introduced timing again. Awareness meeting intrusion. I remember her moving back, he added. A pause. Not running. Just stepping away. The detective's pen didn't move. It didn't need to. This wasn't transcription anymore. This was alignment. What happened then? He asked quietly. The man's jaw tightened slightly, the first visible physical reaction that wasn't tied to restraint or composure, but to something deeper, less controlled. I don't remember every detail, he said again. A return to limitation, but not a full retreat. That part is unclear. Then, after a beat, but I remember noise. That word again. Noise. Not action. Not violence. Not intent. Just disruption. I remember things moving, he continued. Her backing away more. The space getting tighter. He paused. Longer this time. And then it wasn't quiet anymore. The detective didn't press immediately. Because not quiet anymore is where cases like this change categories. From unknown to irreversible. Did you intend to hurt her? The detective asked, finally. Direct. Clean. No framing. The man looked up this time. Properly. For the first time since the interrogation began. And in that look, there wasn't clarity. There was strain. Like two versions of the same memory occupying the same space and refusing to reconcile. I didn't go there to do anything, he said slowly. Then, a pause that lasted longer than all previous ones combined. But I know what happened. The sentence hung. Not fully formed in meaning yet, but no longer avoidable. Outside, news feeds had already escalated again. Not just reporting arrest details, but reconstructing narrative arcs. Cold case breakthrough. DNA confirmation. Long unsolved Texas murder revisited. The language kept shifting between certainty and speculation, as if the world outside the room was trying to catch up with something that still hadn't fully revealed itself inside it. Inside, the detective leaned back slightly. Not because the tension had eased, but because the direction had become clearer. Tell me what happened, he said. A final opening. The man didn't answer immediately. His eyes dropped again. And when he spoke, the tone had changed. Not confession. Not denial. Something closer to inevitability. It happened quickly, he said again. But this time, the phrase didn't repeat. It expanded. I remember realizing I shouldn't have been there at all, he added. A pause. And then everything just collapsed into itself. The detective's gaze sharpened. Collapsed. A nod. I didn't plan it, he said again. It wasn't supposed to be anything. But now the contradiction had fully formed. Because something that wasn't supposed to be anything had become the defining moment of a life, of a case, of a town's history. And that contradiction is where cold cases finally stop being cold. They start becoming something else entirely. Alive again. Unstable. And no longer willing to stay silent. The room no longer felt like an interrogation space. It felt like a reconstruction chamber. Every word now had weight beyond its sound, as if the past itself was being reassembled in real time, piece by piece, under fluorescent light that refused to flicker no matter how heavy the truth became. The man sat still, but stillness had changed meaning. It wasn't control anymore. It was containment. Something inside him was no longer being kept quiet out of choice, but out of habit so old it had become instinct. The detective didn't look away, because this was the point where cases either dissolved back into ambiguity or finally became something solid enough to hold. Start from the moment you say it collapsed, he said. No softness now, only precision. The man inhaled slowly, and for the first time, his voice didn't sound like it was being carefully constructed. It sounded like it was arriving on its own. I went closer, he said. A pause. I shouldn't have, but I did. The hallway returned again, but now it wasn't static. It had depth, distance, movement. The air inside it felt heavier than before, as if memory itself was refusing to stay flattened into narrative. I remember her backing away, he continued. Not screaming. Not at first. Just stepping back like she was trying to understand what was happening. The detective's pen remained still. Every detail mattered now. Not for record, for structure. And then, he asked. The man's jaw tightened. Then she realized I wasn't leaving. Silence followed immediately, because that sentence changed everything that had been implied so far. Not intrusion, not accident. Stall. Presence that refused to dissolve. I think I said something, he added quickly, almost interrupting himself. The detective leaned forward slightly. What did you say? A pause. I don't remember the exact words, he admitted, but I remember it wasn't calm. That distinction mattered, because tone often survives when language doesn't. And her reaction, the detective pressed. Another hesitation. She moved toward the end of the hallway, he said, like she was trying to get distance. The image formed without needing description. A narrowing space, a retreat that doesn't reach safety, a boundary that fails to hold. I followed, he added. No embellishment, no justification, just motion. And then it happened fast, he said again. But this time, fast carried a different weight. Not vague, not evasive, compressed, like everything inside that moment had folded into itself until it no longer behaved like time. I remember her turning, he continued, like she was going to reach something. A door. A wall. I don't know. His voice tightened, and then everything stopped making sense. The detective didn't interrupt, because now the narrative was approaching its fracture point. What do you mean? He asked quietly. A long pause. I remember impact, the man said finally. The word landed differently this time. Not abstract. Not reconstructed. Anchored. I remember the sound more than anything, he added. After that, it was just chaos. Chaos. A word that investigators hear often in cases like this, but rarely in a way that clarifies anything. Chaos is what people use when sequence breaks down, when memory refuses to stay linear, when the brain refuses to organize what the body experienced. The detective held his gaze steady. And after that? He asked. The man exhaled. Long. Controlled. I left, he said. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just departure. That simplicity made the moment heavier than anything before it, because leaving defines everything that comes after. The detective didn't speak immediately. He let it sit, let it expand, because in cases that span decades, the moment of exit is often more revealing than the moment of contact. You left her there, he said finally. Not accusation. Confirmation. The man didn't respond, but his silence was no longer neutral. It was loaded, and that was enough. Outside the room, the investigation had entered full acceleration. Old reports were being re-examined with a new assumption that the original timeline had never been complete. Forensic notes were rechecked, gaps remeasured, witness statements reinterpreted under the pressure of confirmed DNA presence. Inside, the detective slid another photograph onto the table. Not the victim this time. The house. The hallway. The exact space being described. I want you to look, he said. The man didn't immediately comply, because looking means anchoring memory to evidence, and anchoring makes denial harder to sustain. Eventually, his eyes dropped, and when they did, something subtle changed again. Not shock, not recognition in the dramatic sense, but alignment, like two versions of the same moment finally overlapping. I remember that, he said quietly. The detective didn't react outwardly. Which part? He asked. The man's voice lowered further. The light, he said. It was on. I remember that. It made everything look too clear. Too clear. That detail mattered. Because clarity doesn't soften memory. It sharpens it. And you're sure you were the only one there? The detective asked. A pause. Longer than before. I didn't see anyone else, he said. The phrasing again. Not absolute. Not clean. But bounded by perception. The detective held steady. That's not the same as no one else being there, he said quietly. No response. Because now the case was entering its most unstable phase. Interpretation. Not just what happened, but what was perceived, and what was missed, and what memory refuses to hold in full. The man leaned back slightly, as if the weight of the reconstructed night had finally reached its limit of containment. I didn't go there, too, he started again. Then stopped, because the sentence no longer had a safe ending. And for the first time since the interrogation began, the detective saw something shift in him that wasn't denial, wasn't control, wasn't avoidance. It was exhaustion, not physical, temporal. The exhaustion of a moment that has been carried for decades, finally being forced to speak in sequence. And outside, the case that had once been sealed under cold classification was now something else entirely. Not solved, not finished, but undeniably awake, and still unfolding. The exhaustion didn't leave him. It settled in, not like surrender, not like confession, but like something structural giving way after holding tension for too long. The kind of fatigue that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying a version of an event that refuses to stay contained once it's been spoken aloud. The room stayed still. Even the air felt measured now, like it was waiting for permission to move again. The detective didn't rush the silence. He let it do its work, because at this stage, silence wasn't absence. It was pressure applied evenly, everywhere at once. The case file lay open on the table between them, but it no longer felt like documentation. It felt like a mirror being held at an angle neither side could fully avoid. You said you left, the detective finally said. The man didn't respond immediately. His eyes stayed lowered, fixed somewhere near his hands, but not on them, as if the concept of them belonged slightly outside himself. "I did," he said eventually. A pause. "I remember the hallway behind me when I walked out." That detail mattered more than he seemed to realize, because memory of exit often survives more clearly than memory of entry. Entry is uncertainty. Exit is consequence. The detective leaned forward slightly. "And you didn't call anyone? No question in it now. Just structure. No. Simple. Final." And in that simplicity, something hardened in the room. Not judgment. Not yet. But alignment. Cause and sequence beginning to lock into place. Outside the interrogation room, the investigation had entered a different phase entirely. Evidence that had once been archived as historical was now being reprocessed under modern forensic standards. Samples that had been meaningless decades ago were now being cross-referenced, rechecked, validated through systems that didn't exist when the case was first opened. And every result was pointing in the same direction. Not away from him. Toward him. Inside, the detective slid another document forward. Not a photograph this time. A report. Updated. Recent. He didn't speak immediately, letting the man register its presence first. The kind of silence that forces attention without demand. The man glanced at it, then away, then back again. Something subtle shifted in his posture. Recognition without readiness. "We ran it again," the detective said quietly. A pause. Multiple confirmations. The words were careful, not exaggerated, not emotional, just factual weight delivered without decoration. The man's throat moved slightly as he swallowed, but he didn't speak. The detective continued. "The DNA doesn't change. It doesn't evolve. It doesn't reinterpret itself based on memory." A pause. "It places you there." Silence followed. Not resistance this time. Something closer to strain. Because when physical evidence aligns too cleanly with reconstructed memory, the space left for ambiguity begins to collapse. The man finally looked up. Fully this time. And what was visible now wasn't panic. It wasn't denial either. It was something more complicated. The realization that narrative and evidence were no longer separate lanes. They were converging. "I didn't think it would stay," he said quietly. That sentence shifted the room again. The detective didn't respond immediately. "Stay," he repeated. The man nodded slightly. "The past," he said. "I didn't think it would stay like that. Not legal language. Not forensic language. Personal language. The kind that reveals how a person has been organizing reality for years." "You thought it would disappear," the detective said. Not accusation. Translation. The man didn't correct him. And that absence of correction mattered more than agreement. Because now the case wasn't just about what happened in 1998. It was about what had been believed since then. How memory and consequence had been kept separate long after they should have collided. Outside, the newsroom cycle had fully consumed the story now. Cold case solved. DNA breakthrough. Arrest confirmed. But none of those phrases matched the tone inside this room anymore. Because solved implied closure, and nothing here was closing. It was opening. Wider. Deeper. Unstable. The detective opened another folder. This one contained a timeline reconstruction built from everything they had re-verified since the arrest. It wasn't final. Nothing was final yet, but it was close enough to start forming a continuous line. He placed it down without emphasis. "We've mapped what we can," he said. A pause. "And it doesn't move without you in it." That sentence hung differently, because it removed the possibility of isolation, removed the idea that this was a single point of action disconnected from everything else. The man stared at it for a long time, long enough that silence stopped feeling like pressure and started feeling like exposure. "I didn't go there thinking," he started, then stopped again, because what he was trying to separate no longer separated cleanly. The detective watched him closely. "You keep returning to intention," he said quietly. A pause. "But we're already past intention." That line landed heavily, because intention belongs to the beginning of stories. Evidence belongs to what remains after they end. And this case had moved far beyond beginnings. The man leaned forward slightly, elbows now resting on the table, as if physical grounding was becoming necessary. "I don't remember everything clearly," he said again. But the repetition this time felt different. Not defensive. Structural. As if he was trying to define the limits of what could still be retrieved. The detective nodded once. "That's fine," he said. A pause. "We don't need everything." Another silence followed. Not empty. Directed. Because what remained unspoken was beginning to outweigh what had been said. And somewhere in that imbalance, the final shape of the night in 1998 was starting to emerge, not as a single moment, but as a sequence of irreversible steps, each one narrowing the distance between uncertainty and consequence. The detective closed the folder slowly, not as an ending, but as acknowledgement that they were approaching something that no longer needed introduction, only completion. And for the first time since the interrogation began, the room didn't feel like it was holding a story together. It felt like it was waiting for the last piece to fall into place. The last piece didn't arrive like a revelation. It arrived like pressure finally exceeding containment. No dramatic sound. No sudden movement. Just a shift in the room that everyone felt at the same time, as if the balance between past and present had tilted too far in one direction to recover. The detective placed a final document on the table. He didn't slide it, didn't push it. He set it down carefully, like something that no longer needed emphasis because it already carried enough weight on its own. "This is the latest lab confirmation," he said. A pause. "It's not partial anymore." The man didn't look at it immediately. That hesitation had become familiar now, but this time it carried something different. Not resistance, not avoidance, recognition of inevitability. When his eyes finally dropped, they stayed longer than before. The page contained only a few lines of text. Clinical, precise, detached in the way only forensic language can be. But its impact wasn't in its wording. It was in its finality. The DNA profile recovered from the scene consistent match, statistical certainty beyond reasonable doubt. No ambiguity left. No alternative interpretation. Just alignment. The detective watched him carefully, because this was the moment where structure either collapses or becomes confession. "You're there," he said quietly, not as accusation, as fact placed into the open. The man didn't respond, but something in his breathing changed. Slight, uneven, like his body had begun processing information his mind was still trying to delay. "I didn't think," he started, then stopped. The phrase no longer had stability. The detective didn't let it drift. "You've been saying that," he said. A pause. But thinking doesn't override evidence. Silence followed. He continued, voice steady but lower now. "This isn't about what you thought was happening in 1998. A pause. "This is about what did happen." The man's hands tightened slightly on the edge of the table. Not dramatic, not visible to anyone who wasn't watching closely, but enough to signal that containment was beginning to fail in small, measurable increments. Outside the room, the case had reached a saturation point in public attention. Every outlet had a version of a story now, but none of them matched the texture of what was unfolding behind closed doors. Because public narrative needed clarity, this room did not offer it. It offered sequence. And sequence, in cases like this, is rarely clean. The detective opened the final folder. Inside was the reconstructed timeline, refined through every reprocessed detail, every reanalyzed report, every confirmed data point from decades of investigation compressed into a continuous chain. He placed it between them, not pushing it toward him, just letting it exist. "You walked in," the detective said. A pause. "You stayed." Another pause. "And you left." Each sentence landed like a structural beam being set into place. Not interpretation. Alignment. The man looked at the timeline. For the first time, he didn't look away quickly. He followed it, line by line, as if seeing something external that now refused to remain external. And slowly, something in his expression changed. Not recognition of guilt in the simple sense. Recognition of continuity. That what he had been carrying as fragments for years had already existed elsewhere as structure. "I didn't see it like that," he said quietly. The detective nodded once. "That's usually how it starts," he replied. A pause. "Not seeing it." The man exhaled slowly, but it didn't bring relief. If anything, it sharpened the room further. Because air moving differently signals change more reliably than words do. "I didn't plan it," he said again. But the sentence no longer held weight the way it once did. The detective didn't challenge it directly. Instead, he shifted slightly. Planning isn't the only thing that creates outcomes, he said. A pause. Sometimes sequence is enough. That word lingered. Sequence. Because sequence is what turns movement into consequence without requiring intention to remain stable. The man looked up again. And this time, there was no attempt to maintain distance. Only confrontation with structure that could no longer be avoided. What happens now? He asked. Not defiant. Not resigned. Just present. The detective held his gaze. Now we stop guessing, he said. A pause. And start closing what's already been opened. Outside, the building continued its normal rhythm, unaware of how far the conversation had moved beyond procedural boundaries. But inside, everything had shifted into a different category entirely. Not interrogation, not defense, resolution forming in real time. The man sat back slightly, as if the chair itself had become harder to remain in. And for the first time since the interrogation began, silence didn't feel like pressure. It felt like arrival. Because everything that could be reconstructed had now been reconstructed. Everything that could be aligned had been aligned. And what remained was no longer uncertainty. It was consequence waiting for its final shape. The word closing didn't bring relief. It brought weight, because nothing about this felt like an ending yet. Not in the way cases end when answers arrive neatly packaged and contradictions finally dissolve. This was different. This was a structure tightening, not dissolving. As if every new confirmation only reduced the space left for anything else to exist. The man didn't speak immediately after the detective's last sentence. He just sat there, staring at the timeline on the table, as if it had stopped being paper and started becoming something else entirely. A record, a verdict that hadn't yet been formally declared, but already behaved like one. Outside, somewhere deep in the building, a door closed. Footsteps passed. Life continued in parallel, unaware of how narrow everything had become in this room. The detective broke the silence first. "We're not guessing anymore," he said quietly. "We're confirming what already happened." A pause. "And your account now has to exist alongside that." The man finally looked up. And this time, there was no attempt to reconstruct control. Just fatigue. Not physical exhaustion, but something older. The kind that comes when a story you've held in fragments is forced to exist as a whole. "I don't know how to explain it in a way that makes sense," he said. The detective nodded once. "That's not what we're asking for." A pause. "Just accuracy." That word changed the tone again. Accuracy doesn't care about comfort. It doesn't care about intention. It only cares about alignment between version and evidence. The man looked down again, then slowly back at the photograph of the hallway. And something about his expression shifted, subtle but irreversible. Like the distance between what he remembered and what was documented had finally collapsed into a single point. "I remember standing there," he said quietly. A pause. "I remember her being closer than I thought she would be." The detective didn't interrupt, because now the narrative wasn't being forced. It was emerging under its own pressure. "And I remember," the man continued, then stopped. His voice tightened slightly, not with resistance, but with strain. "I remember not knowing what to do next." Silence followed. Not empty, dense. Because not knowing what to do next is the moment every investigation ultimately revolves around. Not the beginning, not the entry, but the point where choice and consequence collide without preparation. The detective leaned forward slightly. "And then?" he asked. The man exhaled slowly, and then everything changed too fast to stop. That sentence didn't resolve anything, but it stabilized the direction of everything already known. Outside, the case had reached a stage where public interpretation no longer kept up with internal development. Headlines still repeated "cold case solved," but inside this room, solved felt increasingly inaccurate. What was happening wasn't resolution. It was compression. The past being squeezed into present tense consequence. The detective opened another file. This one contained the final forensic alignment summary. Not new evidence, not discovery, just convergence. He placed it down gently. "This is where everything meets," he said. A pause. "Your statement, the physical evidence, the timeline." He let that sit. and it all occupies the same space. The man stared at it for a long time. Long enough that silence stopped feeling like pressure and started feeling like exposure stripped of all defense. "I didn't think it would come back like this," he said again, but weaker now, less like a statement and more like something that had lost its usefulness. The detective didn't respond immediately, because there was nothing left in that sentence to engage with. Only repetition of a past version of reality that no longer held structural integrity. "It didn't come back," the detective said finally. A pause. "It was always here." That landed differently, because it reframed everything. Not return, not revival, continuation. The man's hands shifted slightly on the table. Not fidgeting, not resisting, just reacting to a framework that no longer allowed separation between then and now. "I keep thinking about that night," he said quietly. The detective stayed still. "Do you?" he asked. A pause. The man nodded slightly. "But it doesn't stay in order," he said. "It keeps breaking apart." The detective understood that immediately, because memory under pressure doesn't behave like narrative. It behaves like fragments under weight. "And when it breaks apart?" the detective asked. A long pause. "I don't know what part is me," the man said. Silence followed again, but this time it wasn't procedural. It was something closer to realization beginning to surface without permission. Because when identity separates from memory, what remains becomes difficult to define in legal or emotional terms. The detective closed the folder slowly, not as closure, but as containment. "We're going to move forward from here," he said. A pause. "And everything you've said is now part of the record." The man didn't respond, but he also didn't retreat. And in that stillness, something finally stabilized, not the truth itself, but its direction. Outside, the world continued calling it a solved cold case. Inside, nothing about it felt solved, only exposed, and still unfolding toward something no one in that room was fully ready to name. The folder closed again, but this time it didn't feel like containment. It felt like final pressure before rupture. No one moved for a moment, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the conversation had reached a point where language stopped improving clarity and started risking collapse of what little structure remained. The man sat still, but stillness had changed meaning again. It was no longer fatigue. It was confrontation with something that could no longer be pushed back into fragmented memory. The detective studied him carefully, not as a suspect in motion anymore, but as a narrative reaching its limit of distortion. "There's something you haven't said yet," the detective said quietly. No aggression, no urgency, just certainty that something incomplete was still present in the room. The man didn't respond immediately, and in that pause, the weight of everything said so far seemed to compress further, as if the entire case was narrowing toward a single remaining gap. "I've said what I remember," he said finally. But even as he spoke, the sentence lacked stability. The detective nodded once. "That's not the same as everything that happened." Silence followed. Different now. Not procedural. Not investigative. Personal in a way neither of them fully acknowledged. The detective reached for the final sheet in the file. Not new evidence. Not forensic confirmation. But something else. Context assembled from interviews, revisited statements, and contradictions that only became visible once the timeline was forced into a single continuous line. He didn't slide it forward immediately. He just held it in place. "There's one part of that night that still doesn't align," he said. A pause. "And it only changes depending on what you choose to leave out." The man's eyes narrowed slightly. Not defensive, but aware. Because omission is often more revealing than contradiction. The detective continued. "You said you walked in. You said you followed. You said it ended quickly." A pause. "But none of that explains the gap between entry and exit." Silence deepened again. Because gaps are where meaning either forms or collapses. The man shifted slightly in his seat for the first time in several minutes. Not agitation. Not escape. Something closer to discomfort with structure tightening around him from multiple directions at once. "I don't know what you want me to say," he said quietly. The detective held his gaze. "I don't want anything," he replied. A pause. "I need consistency." That word landed harder than accusation would have. Consistency demands reconstruction without flexibility. The man looked down again. And when he spoke, his voice was lower than before. I remember being inside, he said. A pause. I remember her realizing I wasn't supposed to be there. The detective didn't interrupt. And I remember trying to leave, he added. That sentence shifted the room again. Because trying introduces resistance, conflict, direction that doesn't complete cleanly. You didn't just leave, the detective said quietly. Not question. Correction. The man didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened slightly, not in defiance, but in strain against something that was no longer aligning cleanly inside him. I think I did, he said. But uncertainty had entered the structure now. And once uncertainty enters sequence, certainty becomes harder to restore. The detective leaned forward slightly. That's not what the evidence shows, he said. A pause. And that's not what your own statements align to when placed in order. Silence followed again, this time heavier, because now there was no single anchor left. Only competing versions of the same night collapsing toward each other under reconstruction. The man closed his eyes briefly, longer than before. When he opened them again, something had shifted. Not resolution, not clarity, but exposure. I don't know where it changed, he said quietly. The detective stayed still. That's the part we're trying to locate, he replied. A pause. Not for explanation, for truth. That distinction mattered, because explanation can be fragmented. Truth cannot. Outside the room, the case had begun to take on a different life entirely. Not as investigation, but as narrative being rewritten in real time by every new detail that surfaced. But none of it captured what was happening in here. Because in here, the story wasn't being told anymore. It was being stripped down, layer by layer, until only sequence remained. The man looked at the table again, then at the photographs, then at nothing in particular. And when he spoke again, it wasn't confident. It wasn't structured. It was closer to something breaking through accumulated distance. I remember her looking at me, he said quietly. A pause. And I remember not understanding what that meant at the time. The detective didn't respond. Because now, finally, the reconstruction had reached its most unstable point. Not action, not outcome, perception. And perception is where cases stop belonging only to evidence and start becoming something far harder to contain. The room stayed still, but nothing in it was static anymore. Everything was moving toward its final alignment, and no one in that space was fully in control of what shape that alignment would take next. The room no longer felt like it belonged to either of them. It felt like it belonged to the moment that had been waiting 28 years to finish forming. No one spoke at first. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that could be said had already started to echo in different versions of itself, colliding, overlapping, refusing to settle into a single, stable truth. The man sat still. But stillness now was no longer resistance. It was exposure without protection. The detective watched him for a long moment, then finally reached forward and closed the final folder on the table. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just decisively. The sound of it was small, but it marked the end of something that had been open far too long. We're past reconstruction now, the detective said quietly. A pause. This is confirmation. The man didn't respond immediately. His eyes stayed fixed somewhere between the table and the past, as if the two had finally become indistinguishable. And when he spoke, his voice was lower than before. Not broken, but no longer held together by structure alone. I didn't understand what was happening, he said. The detective didn't interrupt. I thought I was leaving, he continued. A pause. But I don't know if that's what actually happened. Silence followed. Different now. Final in shape, even if nothing official had been declared. Because there comes a point in every cold case where memory stops being the central question. And presence becomes enough. The detective nodded once. That's what the evidence shows, he said. A pause. And that's what will be recorded. The man looked up at him then. Fully. No longer searching for gaps in explanation. Only the weight of alignment between what he remembered and what was now permanent. And what happens to me? He asked. Not defiance. Not pleading. Just consequence entering language at last. The detective held his gaze for a long moment, then answered without emotion. You're charged. A pause. That part doesn't need interpretation. The words didn't land like shock. They landed like gravity, finally acknowledged. Outside the interrogation room, movement resumed in controlled precision. Doors opened. Phones were answered. Procedures activated. The system that had waited for confirmation now moved forward with clarity it hadn't had in decades. Inside, nothing moved immediately, because even resolution takes time to settle into reality. The man lowered his gaze slowly, and for the first time, there was no attempt to reconstruct anything. No alternate version. No distortion. Just the full weight of a night in 1998 finally existing in the same space as the present. "I didn't think it would end like this," he said quietly. The detective stood up, not in reaction, in completion. "It didn't end," he said. A pause. "It caught up. That was all. No further explanation. None needed." The door opened behind the detective, light from the hallway spilling in, cutting across the room that had held every version of the past until there was only one left that mattered. The man didn't resist as officers stepped in. He didn't speak again, not because there was nothing left inside him, but because everything that had once been fragmented had finally aligned into something that no longer required interpretation. As he was let out, the hallway felt the same as it always had, but nothing inside it was. Some cases don't end when they are solved. They end when time stops protecting them. And in that moment, as the cold case finally closed its last gap, what remained wasn't mystery. It was consequence, walking forward into daylight for the first time in decades, no longer waiting to be understood. The case file didn't close when the doors did. It closed when silence finally stopped behaving like uncertainty and started behaving like aftermath. Outside the station, daylight looked ordinary in a way that felt almost disrespectful to what had just unfolded inside. Cars moved. People walked. A city continued performing its usual rhythm without acknowledging that, somewhere behind reinforced walls, a 28-year fracture in time had finally been sealed into something finite. But inside the system, nothing was ordinary anymore. The case number that had once been labeled inactive, archived, and forgotten in administrative layers now carried a different weight. It had moved categories without ceremony. Cold case to active prosecution to confirmed charge to recorded truth. And still, none of those labels fully contained what it had become. In the evidence room, the old boxes were brought back out again, not because they were needed for discovery, but because they now meant something different. Photographs that had once been questioned were no longer questioned. They were contextualized. Reports that had once been speculative were now directional. Every piece of paper, every note, every preserved fragment of that night in 1998 had shifted from uncertainty into sequence. What had changed wasn't the evidence. It was the position of the evidence in time. And time, once aligned, is irreversible. The detective stood alone in the hallway for a moment before leaving the building. No celebration, no visible relief, just a long pause, as if listening to a silence that had taken decades to arrive. Cases like this don't leave cleanly. They leave residue. Not emotional, structural. Back in the interrogation room, the chair where the man had been sitting remained slightly turned, as if it hadn't fully accepted that the presence occupying it was no longer there. The table still held the faint imprint of hours of tension, hands, documents, decisions that had finally reached their endpoint. But even that endpoint felt temporary, because somewhere, in another part of the system, forms were being completed, statements were being finalized, timelines were being officially entered into record. The language of law was catching up with the language of reconstruction. And in that translation, something subtle always changes. Truth becomes procedural, and procedure becomes permanence. Later that night, the detective reviewed the file one last time. Not because it needed correction, but because endings demand witnessing. The final summary no longer read like investigation notes. It read like a sealed narrative. Entry, presence, sequence, exit, consequence. Stripped of ambiguity not because ambiguity never existed, but because it no longer had legal space to remain. Still, as he closed the folder, something lingered. Not doubt, not uncertainty, but awareness that even resolved cases don't fully return the past. They only stop it from expanding further. Outside, the city had already moved on. Lights shifted. Traffic signals changed. Conversations continued in cafes and homes where no one knew the exact shape of what had just concluded behind reinforced doors. But somewhere in that same city, a night from 1998 had finally stopped moving. Not because it was forgotten, but because it had been placed, at last, into its final position. And once a moment is placed correctly in time, it never moves again. Only the present does, and it continues forward, carrying everything that was once unresolved, now permanently understood, but never fully released. The morning after didn't feel like a continuation of the night. It felt like a different system entirely had taken over, one that operated on routine instead of revelation, paperwork instead of pressure, procedure instead of memory. But beneath that surface normalcy, nothing had reset. Everything had simply been recorded, stamped, filed, made permanent in a way that could no longer be undone by silence or time. In the courthouse corridors, voices stayed low, not out of respect but out of instinct. People who had followed the case from the outside now found themselves confronting the reality that closure, when it finally arrives, rarely looks like resolution. It looks like documentation. And documentation is cold in a different way than unanswered questions ever were. Inside holding rooms and administrative offices, signatures were collected. Not dramatic ones, not emotional ones, just necessary ones. Each stroke of ink adding weight to a chain of events that had started decades earlier and only now had found its final legal shape. The man's name now existed in a different context than it had the day before. No longer just part of a reconstructed narrative, now part of a formal record, a fixed point, unmoving. Outside, the press had already begun to adjust its language again. Solved cold case remained the headline, but underneath it, the tone was shifting. Words like charged, confession, forensic confirmation were being rearranged into summaries that tried to compress years of uncertainty into a single readable arc. But arcs don't compress cleanly when they span decades. They fracture into versions, each one incomplete in its own way. Back at the station, the detective stood near the window for a long time without speaking. The building behind him continued operating as if nothing fundamental had changed. Phones rang. Reports were processed. Another case file opened somewhere else, unrelated, unaware of the weight still settling here. But he knew better. Some cases don't leave the room they're solved in. They follow it, not as memory, as structure. Because once you've seen how time collapses under evidence that finally becomes usable, it doesn't separate cleanly again into before and after. It stays layered. The 1998 file was returned to storage that afternoon. Not archived as forgotten, but archived as complete. A label that sounded simple, but carried irreversible meaning. Complete doesn't mean resolved emotionally. It means no further investigative movement is required. And that distinction is where most people misunderstand cases like this. Later, the detective reviewed one final detail that had no procedural requirement anymore, but still refused to feel insignificant. The original report's earliest note: no signs of forced entry. A phrase that had once been a limitation. Now it was a boundary marker for everything that had followed, because that absence had shaped every theory, every misdirection, every year of delay. And in the end, it hadn't been absence at all. It had been information waiting for the right tools to become readable. Outside, evening began to settle over the city in the same way it always had, indifferent to the structures beneath it. People went home. Lights came on. Conversations shifted from news to dinner to ordinary concerns that had nothing to do with cold cases or DNA matches or reconstructed nights from decades past. But somewhere in that quiet return to normalcy, something remained altered. Not visible, not spoken, but present in the way institutions now understood that even sealed time can reopen when technology finally catches up to truth. And in that understanding, the past no longer felt distant. It felt available, waiting, not to repeat itself, but to be found, eventually, wherever it had been left. The case was no longer active, but it was never truly gone. It had simply changed forms, from investigation to record, from record to precedent, from precedent to something quieter, heavier, and far more permanent in the way it lived inside the system that had once struggled to understand it. Months after the final filings, the building felt different in ways no one openly acknowledged. Not because anything had physically changed, but because everyone who had been part of the case now carried the awareness that they had seen time behave differently than it was supposed to. Cold cases are supposed to stay cold. They are supposed to remain suspended, incomplete, waiting for answers that may never arrive. This one hadn't waited. It had moved forward only when the world finally caught up. In the archives, the file was placed in its final section. Not forgotten, not erased, but complete in the strictest sense the system allows. And yet, no one who handled it treated it like other closed cases. Because closure, in this instance, didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a boundary had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. The detective who had led the final interrogation didn't request reassignment immediately. He stayed with the paperwork longer than required, not out of procedure, but out of something closer to reflection without language. Each page he reviewed now carried a double existence, what was known then, and what had been confirmed later. And between those two states, a gap that time had finally been forced to bridge. He remembered the room not as it had been at the end, but as it had felt when the alignment first began, when fragments stopped behaving like fragments and started behaving like sequence. Entry, presence, exit, consequence, simple words, irreversible order. Outside, life continued in its usual disregard for internal institutional shifts. Cases like this do not announce themselves to the world with clarity equal to their internal weight. The public received resolution in headlines. The system received it in classification changes. And the people inside it received something harder to articulate. The knowledge that truth, once delayed, does not arrive gently. It arrives fully formed, with all its missing years attached. Somewhere in the city, the name attached to the case now belonged to a different context entirely. Not speculation, not rumor, not unresolved mystery. It belonged to record, to charge, to legal consequence. But even that transformation did not erase the earlier versions of a story that had lived for decades in uncertainty. It only replaced them in official space. In human memory, they remained layered, coexisting, unresolved in their own ways. The detective visited the hallway where it had all narrowed for the last time. It looked ordinary again, as hallways always do after events that reshape their meaning. But meaning is not stored in walls. It is stored in what those walls have contained. And once something like that happens, even emptiness is no longer neutral. It is marked, not visibly, but permanently. He stood there for a long moment without moving, not replaying the case, but acknowledging its final shape in a way that did not require words. Cold cases are often described as solved when evidence arrives. But this one had shown something different, that some cases are not solved when truth appears. They are solved when time finally allows truth to exist in the same space as consequence. And once that happens, nothing returns to how it was before. Not the case, not the system, not the people who stood close enough to watch it finally change. And long after the file was closed for the last time, what remained was not mystery. It was the awareness that somewhere, in the overlap between memory and record, the past had finally been forced to speak in full. And it would not need to speak again.